Thank you all for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure to be here to share with you all and to speak with you all. If you have just if you didn't have time to read the session and just decided to join us, I'll quickly give us a brief introduction. I guess it's also for those who will be watching this at a later point. Today's talk is about flowers for our loved ones at what cost? And the brief was flower farming is $1 million industry spanning their entire globe. Cut flowers imported to the UK amount to 86% of blooms sold across the country in 2019, with 800 million hectares of land and growing in the global south in production to supply the demand of the global north. Behind the beauty of cut flowers lie uncomfortable truths about the industry, racial inequality, barriers to land access and stewardship, climate injustice, truths that are starting to be addressed within the farming collective. With this in mind, what is our responsibility as UK flower farmers to the global south and to the client base in the global north? So thank you for joining us, a group of female farmers of the diaspora who are working to change the industry and how together we can start changing the narratives and the culture within flower farming and farming as a whole. We shift over to the next slide. Just take a moment to introduce ourselves. We are all flower farmer scholarship recipients from Flower from the Farm. And we wanted to just take a moment to share with you what our journey kind of has been, but also most importantly, how having had this experience of being from the Flower Fellowship, how what we've learned and how we can begin to shift some of the narratives and culture within the flower farming. So we'll just take a moment to then introduce ourselves and then we'll continue on from there. Since I'm already speaking, I'll just go ahead and start that. My name is Andrea Ferdinand, or Dre Ferdinand, as you see it written in the little box. You may see it in different places in different ways. It's the same person, it's me. So don't be like, who is that? Here it's listed as a botanical practitioner, and that is because I haven't quite decided a business name yet. And you'll hear a bit more about that later on throughout today's session.
Okay, so if we're going that way, my name's Yeong, and I grow in Oxford. So I grow right in the centre of Oxford. So it's quite, I'm in quite an urban area, and I grow on the mixture of my small back garden and a half plot size allotment. So that's like a 6x8 metre space. So it's not a tremendous amount of space. And I offer gifting bouquets. I run subscription flower service throughout the year. I run mindful making sessions, and a couple of things that I'm actually starting this year is I'm collaborating with the secondary school to create a floral garden, or a space really for the teenagers to be able to hang out. So these are kids who don't receive support through CAMS, but are struggling at school and need sometimes just to step out of the classroom and sit somewhere quiet and safe and secluded. So I'm working with the school to help co-create a space for those kids, and they could be immersed in kind of floral visual delight. I'm also hoping to run mindful making workshops for groups who might not necessarily have access to that. So that might be, for example, if I think about, my parents' generation, a group of older Chinese women, not something that would be something that they would think about. So that's the kind of thing that I'm looking into doing.
I'm Anais. I'll start. Elsie jumped. We're so excited to have everyone here. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm Anais Hawkins. I am a new flower farmer, although my background is in horticulture. Horticulturist by trade. And I've recently set up a flower farm just outside of London in High Wycombe. And it's been a really interesting experience, having been a transplant from the US, to see a lot of common themes that we encounter in the US in terms of accessibility in horticulture and floristry as an industry, mirrored here as well. So looking forward to sharing some of those experiences with you, and also getting to learn a little bit more about each of you who have joined us here in the chat when we get to questions. Elsie?
Hi, everybody. My name's Elsie. I use she, her pronouns. I am a flower farmer and a mental health practitioner based in Bristol. My flower farming is still very much in, as Dre said, we were recipients of the flower farming scholarship from Flowers from the Farm last year. So it's been my first year of growing. I published myself as a florist in 2019 and encountered quite a few barriers to accessing the industry, which I'll be sharing kind of through our discussion today. Mental health practice I've been working in mental health for working from a kind of trauma-informed perspective. So I like to use floristry as a nature connection tool, and that's what I kind of infuse into the workshop. So I use floristry, I teach floristry skills, but with a kind of mental health focus.
Hey, thank you. And I realized that I didn't tell you all anything about me but my name. My background is a social worker, and I'm also a vegetable grower. And as mentioned earlier, I also have a background in horticulture as well, and has been shifting into flower farming. And like Elsie just mentioned, this is our first year of growing. But as we transition into the rest of today's session, just wanted to share with you a bit more about flower farming, and just the floriculture and floristry in itself. And so, like many of us, and as the title suggests, flowers for our loved ones. And so we are oftentimes investing in beautiful flowers, which are not only beautiful, but also powerful symbols. And people around the world have used them for various reasons, such as, marking rites of passages, significant life events such as weddings, funerals, Mother Days, birthdays, different festivals. And so even if we think about when some of those flowers are, used, when I think of roses, I think of Valentine's Day and Mother's Day to convey love. And when I think of marigold, I think of the celebration of, guiding the dead to their ancestral home for Dia de las Muertas. And then also lilies or tulips, you might think of Easter. And so these flowers have different symbolic meaning, and we tend to navigate and gravitate towards them for different celebrations. And when thinking about just the history of floriculture, it's developed in different countries at different periods and at different times. Here in the UK, it began to become more established in the late 19th century, where they began to grow them on a larger scale, predominantly on vast estates. However, in the US, it was quite different. It was an industry that was predominantly born through immigration, and their use and their knowledge of plant life and history, and also the inaccessibility to employment for various reasons. And so, as we know, the current day floral industry is rapidly growing and has continued to grow tremendously over the past few decades. And a few things that come to mind when I think about the flower industry is that there tend to be three major components. And one of those components is the growers, which is ourselves, the wholesaler, as well as the retailer. So that may be the shops, and you may get it from Waitrose or Sainsbury or wherever you're buying your flowers from. But also in that industry that isn't really considered as one of those major components. And I think about this when I think about growers. Is also the people that live around those places where flowers are being grown. And so although it's not considered, when they think about it in the floriculture industry, as a major component, but that is also important, the environment where they're grown and people who live within that environment. So I'm gonna, I'm just gonna hand over, and as we transition on to the next slide, I just wanna give a bit more information about today's topic and session. So as I've kind of given you an introduction, not only in what the briefing of it was, but just a bit of the history of flower farming, we're going to take a moment to just pull back the curtains a bit more, and then we'll also begin to explore some of the challenges at our doorstep, and also begin to reimagine. If we know that we have challenges, how can we begin to reimagine a different outcome or a different input for that? And most importantly, what can we do?
Thanks, Dre, for that. So as Dre mentioned, we've seen a real move of, let's say, flower cultivation, flower growing to the equatorial South. And part of our session was talking about, what are our obligations as global North consumers to the global South, who are producing and exporting and growing a lot of the products that we see in our own events here in our own back gardens as well. It's really just looking at how dynamic and profitable, for one, this industry is as a global market. So we've seen a lot of the traditionally domestic flower growing shifting down to areas like Colombia, Ecuador, and the equatorial South, largely because things that grow here in the winter and don't grow here in the winter grow really well along the equatorial South. So from a growing perspective, it makes sense to cultivate flowers that, like, especially roses. Roses is almost always the key example that we use when we're discussing topics like this. Roses at this time of year, normally, not factoring in changes due to climate, but normally would not be in bloom around this time, even going into February, March. But we see such a huge demand for flowers that don't grow in our own backyards at certain times of year, seasonal flowers that are then imported. And it's a huge, huge industry, up to about $55 billion US a year. And this is pre-pandemic figures. So we'll touch a little bit more on how the pandemic has really shifted consumers and growers' mindset in terms of the floral industry as a whole and our impact. So as you can see here, the numbers really do a lot of talking. So the US is ultimately the biggest importer of cut flowers, and they are largely supplied by farmers in Colombia and Ecuador. These shipments are usually air freighted on a huge plane. I think Miami receives pre-pandemic 30 to 35 flights every day of flowers that have been sent from Colombia and Ecuador in a cold chain supply chain and are due to arrive and then be shipped off to whatever florist or end design product they're heading to within 3 to 5 days. So the pressure to shift a huge crop of flowers from the South to the North leads a huge environmental impact on the environment. And I think a lot of us as our own flower growers have come into this from a perspective of looking at how we can really start to change the narratives and the impact of the floral industry as a whole, not only on the environment, but on the people who we rely so heavily on to cultivate these flowers, and really trying to address and hopefully change the narrative of exploitation within our industry, looking at the use of pesticides, really human rights abuses within the supply chain, really focusing and shining a light on some of the inequalities across the supply chain within floriculture to really start to make this a better industry. There's so much beauty involved in what we do, but as we pull back the curtain and start to look at some of the issues across the supply chain, it raises a lot of questions. And I think where we are as horticulturists, floriculturists, florists, we're really starting to change the narrative, especially with our customers, about raising awareness and shining a light on some of the issues that we're all collectively trying to address. One, to make it a better working environment for everyone involved, from the growers to the florists and their customers, and most importantly, the environment as well. So I think we're on a really interesting trajectory at this point, especially post-pandemic. And we can see here, a lot of the biggest exports come from the Netherlands and the equatorial South. And I think the pandemic really shone a light on how fragile these ecosystems are. We are so dependent on, well, primarily plains, to get huge crops over to the US and across Europe. And I think at the beginning of the first pandemic lockdown, we saw over 400 million flowers that were destroyed in the Netherlands because there was absolutely no way to get them to the people who had ordered them. And there was a real, obviously, events got canceled. And so the fragility of our system just was on show for everyone to see. And I think it's been an interesting opportunity to view how the pandemic has really impacted our supply chain and our industry, and the conversations that we're now starting to have around floriculture and growing cut flowers. We've seen a movement long before the pandemic, but starting to come here to fruition, of a focus on slow flowers and domestic flower farming, and having a conversation with customers who want roses in January and February as to why we can't provide them with roses, and taking them on that journey with us that I think, traditional vegetable farmers or other farmers across our industry have been having with their customers as well, in terms of seasonality and local produce. So it's been really interesting, certainly as a flower farmer, to be on this journey and taking other florists with us on this journey of really focusing back on domestic flower farms, because when the pandemic hit, I think there was a lot of concern, obviously and naturally, about how would we shift these flowers these crops that we'd grown, how would we get them to our customers? And there was huge demand here in the UK for local domestically grown flowers, which was absolutely incredible. And I think now we're starting to see a resurgence of customers really looking for locally grown and sourcing locally grown flowers and produce, and to support all of their celebrations and events. I think, again, it's really important that we touch on environmental and social consequences of our industry. I think we'll come on to some of the nuance, probably, I'm sure, in the questions, but it is so important for us not only to really keep in mind, our use of pesticides, chemicals on our crops, but also looking at how we create a workforce, one that's sustainable, and two, that really supports our own workforce to really thrive and not mirror a lot of the practices that we see happening in the global South. And I think I'll hand over to Elsie to share a little bit more about some of the things that we're seeing here as a collective.
Thanks, Anais. So as Anais was explaining, we have this industry that spans the entire globe, with a large proportion of the flowers being grown in these equatorial regions. And often within these equatorial regions, the labor is cheap. Exploitation, and the floristry industry is known for its heavy use of pesticides, greenhouse gas emissions, and resulting pollution of the soils and the water tables. So despite this industry raking in billions of pounds per annum, this money doesn't make it down to its workers. On average, a Colombian flower grower earns around $300 per month. And in Kenya, it's reported to be as low as $100 a month. And so this industry is heavily reliant on a workforce which is racialized and also majority female. And due to these people occupying these intersections of race, gender, and socioeconomic status, they're often impacted by a whole range of different social justice and human rights issues. These can be things such as high level of exposure to pesticides, which has reportedly impacted people's health and fertility. And there are a number of studies on how women, particularly in Colombia's fertility and birthing has been impacted by their work. Poor pay, as I've explained, sexual exploitation, and lack of access to clean water and poisoned local soils. So not only are the people working in these environments impacted by the pesticides that they're using every day, but then the water table in the areas in which they're surrounded are then polluted as well. So they're having this kind of double impact. So these labour standards are kind of a legacy of colonialism, and these kind of mechanisms continue to work through this day, where we're having this accumulation of wealth centering in Western countries, and the polluting industries residing in areas where people of colour live and marginalised communities reside. And thinking about this kind of legacy of colonialism, it not only impacts the flower industry outside of the UK, but also impacts us as flower growers here. So Black and Asian people are more likely to live in urban environments. So there's only 1.9% of Black people and 2.6% of Asian people living in the countryside in the UK. So this impacts on our act space. In England, Black people are nearly 4 times more likely compared to white people to not have access to outdoor space at home in the form of either a private patio or even a balcony. Because of this urbanization, Black and Asian people are affected by environmental conditions which create stress and therefore impact health. There's been a body of research that demonstrates that amygdala, so amygdala is the part of the brain that reacts to danger, which increases our levels of cortisol and conditions. And being cut off from a connection to nature in this way impacts not only our health and wellness, but also makes it more to develop the land-based skills needed to become a grower, and meaning that the industry continues to be the same without the innovation of people of colour. There are kind of other barriers to becoming a flower farmer and a florist, and there's a few just on the slide next, Anais. So I just briefly talked just then on barriers to land access and stewardship, which has a lot to do with urbanization of people of colour, which also has a kind of legacy of migration and where communities of colour were placed when they first arrived in the UK. And then we have a kind of issue of gatekeeping within this industry. In itself is kind of a barrier to becoming a flower farmer, and then the impact that has within the industry. So I know that when I started out as a florist, I contacted many florists in my local area to kind of offer my time for and heard back from one in that excursion. And the only reason why I heard back from this because I went into their shop to speak face to face. You go through kind of certain institutions, businesses, land or support. And often these will have an institutionally racist history. And this can be something that's really difficult to kind of marry up inside yourself, where you know that your dream of becoming a grower means that you have to encounter systems. There's a kind of chicken and egg situation that happens. Often, you know, some people get into flowers, they're really interested in the growing side, but often in order for us to market our product, we need to develop floristry skills. Also, apologies, I think my internet connection is slightly dodgy, so I'll try and slow down, and let me know if there are any points that you would like me to make again. So yeah, so in order to become a flower grower, often you need to market your product, which means developing some floristry skills. What I noticed within kind of entering the florist world is that there is this there's this chicken and egg situation where florists don't want to take you on if you don't have any experience, but you can't gain any experience without being taken on. So becoming a florist can take a huge amount of effort, which can take its toll on your confidence and self-esteem. You have to position yourself in an industry that's only presented closed doors to you and functions highly on nepotism, and that can be a really isolating experience. I touched earlier on kind of coming across or encountering institutions to develop your growing skills, and sometimes those institutions will have a racist history. So there are a kind of variety of practices around like renaming plants, which often has a colonial history, kind of across agriculture as a whole, less so now, but historically there's been a lack of respect or acknowledgement for indigenous land practices, and also the labeling and treatment of people as unskilled laborers. I think that sits uncomfortably for all of us in the fellowship. And I count these as being kind of horticultural microaggressions. It's like these kind of slow building things that you encounter when you're doing a vocation that's been a dream of yours for a while. You're still, even within this industry, encountering these things which start to kind of have an impact to encounter as you are becoming a grower. And I think that all of us have experienced these things in one way or another on our journey to becoming a flower grower. Although the scholarship was really timely, and I'm really thankful that it came, but these dreams aren't new. And I'm sure that both Jenny, Anais, Andrea have held these dreams of becoming a flower grower for a while, but it's taken the encountering of all of these barriers to kind of get to where we are now.
Brilliant, thank you, Elsie. So what is our responsibility, and how do we respond to this, and what is our responsibility to the global north? So the only way that I could really approach this is because when I sort of kind of like prodded my brain a little bit, I couldn't kind of come up with anything. But actually, when I kind of move into what the felt experience of being a grower is, it feels like I can actually respond more authentically. So I'm going to respond in terms of my reflections as a grower, or our reflections as a grower, and then that will lead to a response and our responsibility to the global north. So one of the things that comes to me most is that it's impossible to talk about flowers without talking about beauty and our ideas of beauty. You know, we all have very strong beauty and scent. So we have very strong images of flowers in particular and what they mean to us at certain times. So Dre had talked about kind of rites of passage, marking different times in our lives. the scent of sweet peas always reminds me of childhood. I grew up, my mother is a fantastic gardener, and she has a love of dahlias, which she has completely passed on to me. And I remember being a child and standing next to dinner plate dahlias, which was much bigger than my head. And the impression that it left upon me, you know, to be able to see this incredibly bright yellow flower that, you know, is like looking into the sun. So we have ideas and impressions of what flowers mean to us. And then we have expectations attached to them. So we might have an expectation that red roses are really important for Valentine's Day, and then an expectation that not only are they important, but because we can't compartmentalize things, they should be cheaper than they were last year, or why can't they be cheaper? So kind of a lack of joining the dots. And it's really, I think, one of the things that I find really interesting is before getting into flower farming, I think of what would be an opulent and luxurious bunch of flowers. And for me, that would be maybe peonies and lilies. But of course, peonies and lilies don't exist when you're looking seasonally. They don't exist in November. So one of the things I started looking at is how to review our idea of beauty. How to review our idea of beautiful flowers. And so it's learning to offer our customers the opportunity of viewing flowers through fresh eyes, but actually they're actually looking at things through ancient eyes, because we're learning to connect more with growth, growing from seed, having a greater respect for the vagaries of the weather, and seeing within the physical flower the non-flower elements, and the flower beyond its life in the vase, and all the invisible things that a flower may offer us to support and beautify our lives, like medicinal qualities, or use as dyes or as food. So I feel like I'm learning to review beauty and understand our idea of what is beautiful can be really important. And seasonal flowers are amazing. You know, now that I grow flowers, I can't imagine having shop bought flowers. I see them in the supermarket, and they're uniform. There's something so artificial about them, not only the way that they're produced and the way that they're over pesticided in order to get into the supermarket or even to get into a country. There's something really unsustainable about that. You see locally cut flowers and they're alive, there's movement, there's wonkiness, and they continue growing and they smell amazing. And I think that's something that people are learning to appreciate more. And there's another thing that I think is really important when I think about kind of reflecting as a grower is how it has expanded possibilities. What is now possible? So I grow on a very small scale. And for those who are blessed with a garden or a window, in fact, you can also have a window box. So everyone is available and able to grow should they wish or should they have the desire to. So I feel part of our responsibility is to share knowledge and experience to those who might have an inkling or an interest in growing their own flowers, and showing them what is possible and how to do it. Because I don't know about you, but I actually need to see things done. I need to see what a flower looks like. I need to see it happening for me to kind of believe it or to trust that it can happen. Also to show clients that flowers that might be beneficial to their garden, so pollinators, or flowers that are good for pollinators, creating confidence in good soil health. So for example, lasagna laying soil, how they can do it. You know, I remember the first time I created that and opened it up, it was just pure alchemy. I couldn't believe the fizzy joy of seeing the magic of this black gold that had been created by these things that I could not see. So it's kind of being able to see the things that we can't see and trust in them. So that brings me on to the other thing of trust. So we're like, you know, for those who are growers out there, there's nothing more amazing than looking at the bare earth. You know, you've planted your tulips, you're looking at the bare earth, and there is trust that when the conditions are right, the flower will appear. And that is an enormous thing to have that trust in what the conditions could be. And also trust that when you're mulching the ground or when you're putting manure onto the ground, that there will be an alchemy involved that will create rich, healthy soil for your plants for the following year. So I feel that there's an investment in trust. There's an investment in resilience. So you've grown you've planted your bulbs, they started to pop up, and suddenly, gosh, the weather dips, the weather changes, and you have a freezing fog and snowy conditions for the next 10 days. And you've just noticed that your crocuses are just starting to come out. And you think, oh my goodness, how are they going to make it? But the flowers are so resilient. Time and time again, I'm always amazed at how resilient plants are, how resilient flowers are. And we are part of the system of nature. So it's also kind of mirroring and touching upon and supporting our own resilience and our own trust. Now, when I go to the plot, I might go there just to deadhead and to pick some blooms, but then I might often find myself in a situation 3 hours later where I'm kind of staring at the quality of light on the petal, or watching the breeze play around through the leaves. And I think there's something really important about offering the opportunity to immerse ourselves into in the cold growing process. You know, as soon as we place our hands into the earth, we're immersing ourselves into something much bigger than ourselves, and offering people the opportunity to do that by encouraging our customers to grow their own, or to, in whatever capacity that they can, is a really important thing that happens. Because each time that we immerse ourselves in the growing process, we're drip feeding that spring of well-being. And I feel that that is really important, because that spring of well-being never goes away. Each time we feed it, even if we don't manage to go outside for the next 3 months, it's always there, and it's something that we can draw upon. And it also is something that's really unquantifiable. So I have a teenage boy, an older teenage boy, who is so attached to his phone that he can actually walk around without looking up. That's quite a skill, I think. So one of the kind of agreements that we have had recently, through lockdown, is that he comes and helps me out in the plot. And there's a fair amount of complaint around that. And, it's going to be like shoveling muck, perhaps, or making paths, or clearing things. And the first few times, it was done unwillingly. And I did ask him, do you feel that you're getting any benefit for this? He's like, well, for my own thing, I'll do it, but I'm not really. I'm just saying, because you told me to. But actually, what I've noticed is that even though he absolutely does not love shoveling muck, he will spend time looking at the lovely red worms that are creating the environment that will become soil for the plants. And now every week he asks, oh, when are we going to the plot? So if I ask him to quantify what he actually gains from it, I think it'd be really hard for him to articulate, because young people, well, my teenagers especially, are primed to view things through Snapchat and Instagram. So sort of really fast, visual, sharp, quick images that kind of come and then go, and then they're not primed to sit still. Which is why immersion is so important, because it offers us something that is undefinable. It's hard to quantify what it is, but it's there. And once it's there, and once we've started to nurture that seed in ourselves, we have a very, very different relationship to plants. So optimism. People sometimes say to me, oh, Jenny, you're growing flowers from your garden. How sweet. And it is sweet, and it is lovely. But I do feel that a small scale farmer using regenerative farming practices, saving seed, sowing seed, I got into this because this is partly my personal response, and optimistic response, and a way of trying to create move towards solution towards and response towards climate crisis. Now, how can I, in the smallest ways possible, do the next step to beautify our world and find my place within it, and the world as in within the natural world. So small scale farming really can be seen as a progressive environmental act, and it's really important to have that as a possibility, and to remember that what we're doing is really, really important. So what is our responsibility to the client base in the global north? So first thing I would say, some sort of education, as it were, recalibrating our idea of beauty. If you look at, and in some ways it's happening from kind of like celebrities and royalties having members of the royal family having weddings that bring in British plants, British trees, because they can have trees for their wedding, not just plants and flowers. And it's kind of happening from the top down, as it were. The Royal Horticultural Society offers lots of videos and notes on how to plan and how to grow flowers for pollinating, for pollinators. So there is information out there. So it's encouraging our client base to look at information. It's sharing our experiences. It's sharing our knowledge. And who is better placed to do that than the person who's, somebody who's also locally growing in that area. So it's familiar with the soil type, is familiar with the weather conditions of that particular area. I feel that our responsibility as growers is to make sure that our customers know what they're spending their money on, where it comes from, before they buy it. So where it comes from, it's really important to offer the history of a plant. There are so many plants that we now see as traditional cottage garden flowers that have really quite sort of bloody histories. So the dahlia, who would have lived originally in Mexico and lived in large grounds there, was taken over to Spain by the conquistadors over to Spain, and then eventually they came over to the UK. And even though we can't change them, we wouldn't necessarily take all those lovely, beautiful elements that are now so much part of what we see as our garden. It's important to understand the stories that they tell and to decolonize the flowers so that we understand a bit more of what they carry to us. So that increases our appreciation of them, gratitude that they're actually here, and an appreciation of what has happened in order for them to be here, and humility, what has come before for it to be here. And those are really important elements, not only for our relationship to flowers, but our relationship to each other. Another thing that's important for us to convey when responding and to kind of how we look after what our responsibility is to clients in the global north is making people aware that if something is cheap, it means that somebody, and usually something, has been exploited to enable that to happen. Be people, water, land, soil. It's really important to highlight that and to give the customers a real idea of what it takes to grow something. And if you have been able to, or if you're able to encourage your customers and your clients to actually get a sense of what that means by encouraging them to grow something themselves, then it's much better appreciated. One way of doing it is, kind of a more community supported agriculture where your clients pay for subscription services in advance so that they know that they're plowing back into a local business, and being aware that as a business there will be sort of social aspects like working at schools or working with groups who might not have access to flowers in quite the same way, or working in the capacity to help advance or enhance mental health. So can we have the next slide, please? So what are the alternatives? I feel that the current systems don't really work for us. And it's our opportunity now to explore and reimagine our futures. The current paradigms are clunky. We don't really have the language. The systems just don't express what it is that we would like to express. So our imagination is so important in recreating what we would like to see happen. And a lot of people are already able to see in their minds the effect of the food chain and global food production and the environmental impact of that. But many people can't necessarily join the dots for flower production. And it's maybe something that we can help do. It's just like, this is actually what it means to grow locally. This is actually what it means when if you are very desperate for roses in November, for example, to be aware of where you're getting them from, aware of the issues surrounding that, and then making a conscious choice around that. And I feel that as we become more connected to the earth, then people will become less controlling of it, but become more custodians of the earth. And that's all we can really ever do. Yeah, okay, I think I've said enough. Thank you. Dre.
Thank you, Jenny. If we could just go back for a moment and just sit with this idea of courageous reimagining for a moment longer, and just recapping some of the things that have already been said. For example, that knowing that at the start of the pandemic, there were over 400 million flowers that were destroyed in the Netherlands. And if we think about that transportation of plants through different cold chains, but also not that cold chains are bad, but how can we also reimagine or ensure that they are produced or continuously being updated, and that they are continuously upgraded, as well as ensuring that exploring if we could perhaps use alternative fuels, or maybe using cleaner diesel engines, depending on what mode of transportation that they're taking. But also just that reimagining that sense of, shopping locally. We have all experienced moving, within an hour distance from our home and being able to explore, just the beauty and the connections that are around us, and knowing that for a flower to be transported through a cold chain system, it's more likely to have been exposed to pesticides. And it's the likelihood of, you're receiving that flower the following day after it's been picked is not as likely. It's usually going to take 3 to 5 days before that flower arrives to you, whereas locally it can be either the same day or the next day. And so when we think about, that reimagining, often, as Jenny was mentioning, local doesn't always equal cheaper, but what we are aware of when we're shopping locally, we're thinking about our health. We're thinking about our relationships. And, going back to health, when we're thinking about our health, thinking back to some of the things that Elsie shared with us today in terms of the pesticides, in terms of the health impact that it has upon the soil, upon the water, which again comes back to our health. We're going to consume things that will also come from that soil, whether it be our vegetables or water for us to drink. So one way or another, what's happening to the soil will equally in some way impact or happen to us. And as also was mentioned, it's more likely to reduce that sense of, exploitation. So in that reimagining, in terms of the costs, we also have to think about what cost is that having onto us if we were in that environment or within those conditions. So as we've just been gently pulling back the curtains, and as well as exploring some of the challenges, as we start to reimagine, also want us to think about, that idea of, reimagining the outputs. Oftentimes we purchase flowers and we put them on our table. They're gorgeous, as Jenny was just sharing with us, and we admire their beauty. And then some people, hopefully more people, the output for that flower after that is to either be composted or put into the bin. Hopefully we're all more on the composting side, but there's more that can be done to that flower. That flower its sole purpose wasn't to just be picked to look at and admire from that moment of beauty. There's so many other beautiful elements that can be expanded from life, from a plant's life. And so my part for me about reimagining is, how can we extend that plant's life form just beyond the beauty that sat on our table for however many days it was there? How can we as growers, as well as consumers, explore what our responsibilities can be? And so some really amazing things are happening in communities, and people around the world have been looking at different ways to explore how we can, how they have been able to think about the usage of flowers. We think about weddings. Some weddings have, loads of flowers. We think about, festivals, even the Chelsea flower show, and that's a enormous amount of flowers that are used at that point. But what happens to them afterwards? And so not only what is our responsibility, but what is our social responsibility? And the first images that are stacked on top of each other, the top one is the first two on the left-hand side are from our images taken from India, and how they've explored alternative ways to extend that plant life from just going from whatever the purpose of use was, to the compost or into the river, as the flowers would oftentimes end up at the Diwali festival. And so someone thought, how can I reduce this pollution? Because then they became a form of pollution for that community, for that area. And they decided to make incense. And to me, that was quite a beautiful way of exploring how we can how they could expand that plant's life form, and give it more meaning and more opportunity to give joy than just that point of being on the table. The image underneath is an image of a bag that was grown from flowers. And so what they've started doing is this thing called floral, Fleather, where it's the name of this is Fleather, which I think is quite funny in a way, but I like it. And they've looked at how plants can be used to create a form of leather, and so that's quite interesting, because and to some degrees still quite controversial, but creative in the sense that we're addressing an issue of animal rights, but then we're also having to think about, in creating that bag, it does, and although it's reducing the output of waste for that plant, it's also made with elements of PVC, which we are aware of is not recyclable, and is also used by fossil fuels. So it will have a different form of impact upon the environment. Not to say don't engage in it, but just sharing with you different ways that plant life can be extended, and how in those two examples, it was thinking about what is their social responsibility to thinking about animal life, but also the usage and pollution of the river. And so the next two images, the ones in the middle, is even more creative ways of recycling and upcycling. So a beautiful way. After most people have a wedding, they want to, preserve the flowers, and we usually take a million photos. But what I really like about the top image is that it's a rosary. And so what a lot of people aren't aware of is that rosaries are actually made from roses. And so that's a beautiful way of being able to take this plant that you probably would have eventually thrown away at some point, or maybe it lives in maybe you dry it and it becomes its own, that beauty, and that plant continues to live on in that dried, preserved way. But you can also perhaps think of, making an item that you can wear, such as this rosary. And this can be used for, weddings, for it's also quite beautiful for at the funerals. There's a few companies that have started thinking of, after flowers have been used for funerals or weddings, they've transitioned it into jewelry in various ways. Even, for example, my necklace here, it's resin of dandelion seeds. And so it's, thinking of different ways in which that plant life doesn't just have to end there, but it can continue to live on in various ways. The bottom image is of dyeing. Before we had synthetic coloring, all of our textiles were dyed with plants, and that was whether vegetables or flowers. They both are able to provide us beautiful dyes, and even these dyes were used for, and not only dyes but also inks, for writing or and painting. And so when we think about that one usage of that plant, when it starts to wither, you can take that plant and begin to, extract different elements from it. Again, extending that plant's life form. So there's a lot of energy that goes into growing these plants. So how can you also honor that grower's energy, but also that plant's energy, and every element that was required to make that plant evolve to the beauty that inspired you to, want to share a part of that plant's life with it. So these are, again, just different ways that we can explore recycling and upcycling instead of just composting. Composting is beautiful, which is coming up to the last images that are here. The top one is thinking about ways in which, again, this is the beauty about shopping locally. And as Jenny mentioned, how can we start to explore that conversation that happens with growers? We're having that conversation within the vegetable growing scene, in the sense of these are grown locally. This is the conditions and the environment that it was grown. We also do this with our poultry as well. How can we consider this for our plants? How can you know that this flower, if you're deciding to use it, for either healing or wellness or medicinal purposes, is the best plant to use? Again, thinking about those pesticides. So if you decide to make, bath bombs or bath salts or oils or candles or anything of that nature, how can you ensure that you're using a plant that has the best property or qualities, in the essence of not being pesticide free? So you're, again, not causing that harm back to yourself. So when you're shopping locally, you have all of these, or again, I'll bring up to the next point with policy and legislation. Even if it's not locally, how can we then begin to explore, or shift policy and legislation to inform us of where our flowers come from? We have this on our food. We have this on our on even tins and all sorts of packaging, but we don't know where our flowers come from. We don't know what environment they were grown in. We don't know if we're investing in something that has shared values as ours. So these are things that are important to us as consumers, but this isn't something that is being shared with us when we're investing in our flowers. And so the beauty about building that relationship with local growers is that you can begin to know. You can visit their farms. You can engage with them. You can have that discussion about seasons. We know we're knowing more and more about what fruits and vegetables grow in season, but we don't necessarily know about which flowers grow in season. And that's the beauty about shifting that relationship, that reimagining about how we shop and how we engage in what we are investing in. And lastly, I mean, these are different things that we can do as consumers, but these are also things as growers we can explore as well. And to me, what made me begin to explore this extended plant life is after I did a wedding this past September, it was quite, I found myself surrounded by all of these, leaves and petals and things that, a few roses had broke from their stem. And I, having a permaculture background and this no waste principle, is thinking about what am I going to do with all of this? Like, how can I ensure, and at that point, my compost was full, and I was just like, no, there must be alternative ways. So then it was taking it down to the allotment where I grow as well and using that compost. But then thinking there must be more creative ways. And I was already, using more of that wellness component in terms of, hosting bath bomb sessions and bath salts and, just a variety of elements in that nature. But it wasn't enough for the output that I had produced at that time. And so when I think about the first two images, in terms of the incense that have been made, as well as the leather bags, that's a much larger scale of something that can be evolved from that. So if you're not if you can't imagine someone's buying that many flowers every week to, maybe start making bags, but, kudos to you if you are. But just thinking about our responsibility to, just honoring that plant, but also thinking about the value that we're investing and how we can extend our money value as well. And that made me think about policy and legislation, and going back to, I walk into a shop, I have no idea where these flowers have come. I don't know. We know flowers are edible, and even if I see an edible flower there, is that flower edible? Because it's been sprayed with, a significant amount of pesticides. Whereas if you're speaking with your local, grower, you can have that discussion, and you hopefully would have established some form of relationship in being able to know and explore that. And so that's something that we can begin to challenge, especially as, being in the UK and growing flowers in Britain. How can we ensure that our consumers are aware of what they're consuming? And how can we consider legislation about things that are being imported for us to know about where they've come from? I can walk in and know where any apple or pears come from, but I don't know where this flowers come from. Or I may not even know the history of this flower. How did it even arrive in this country, which is a different, element. But these are things that are important. We're working with nature, and how can we continue to respect it and its history, and build those relationships with that plant, or deepen our relationship with that plant. So yeah, just a few ideas to help you start thinking of ways to reimagine what we can do, whether it is from a social responsibility perspective, whether it's upcycling or recycling, or thinking about policy and legislation to ensure that when we are making this investment, we're also investing in ourselves and our health. And so that makes us wonder, what can we do? How can we work together to start changing the narratives in the culture in flower farming? And how can we start to reimagine the future? And so these were just some ideas. And, it's how many people? I think over 60 people that have joined us today. And how can we as a collective, whether we're flower farmers or consumers, begin to think about, can we change that narrative, and how can we start to reimagine? And I would like to just take this moment to encourage anyone who is has the capacity to write in a box to just take a moment to think about that. And how can we work together to start to change the narratives? What ideas have come to mind, or have you been thinking about? Again, it was a moment when I was doing the last wedding floral arrangements that this popped into my mind. And then how can we think about that, the culture and flower farming? Haven't heard what we shared about the challenges today, and pulling back those curtains and thinking about our responsibility. What if we're focusing on injustices and inequalities in various places? How can we also ensure that when we're looking at these flowers and we see beauty, that we actually get a full picture of that beauty, and thinking about how cycles work, and when we're not composting and feeding back into the earth, how can we be ensuring that this plant's life form is extended in many of those ways? And the beauty about most of these ways is that even after you've extracted the oil or the aroma or distilled the created a rose water or whatever, you can still compost that plant afterwards. So we can be creative in that. And so I encourage anyone who has any suggestions that they have been thinking about to drop them in the box, and we can start to reimagine together how the future can be.
I really like what Molly has said here about honoring flowers and plants. She's written, honoring flowers and plants can have something to do with alternate non-financial streams for your surplus when you may have harvested or needed to harvest more than you can use, no different to harvesting food. And I think that's a really good point, Molly. And we've seen community fridges coming up, certainly in the States, community fridge movement, where farmers can pack a refrigerator that's accessible to everyone with surplus crops that people can then take from and use within their homes. And I think there are just so many more opportunities for us as a collective here in the UK, certainly as flower farmers and working alongside food and veg farmers, to really look at how we can start encouraging more access to our crops and have that kind of immersive experience as well, especially from community garden perspectives. From our experience, and certainly my experience here in London, access to green spaces that you can use and immerse yourself in are really hard to come by. So it's just really looking at how we can really join forces to make spaces more accessible to everyone across every spectrum and walk of life, and looking at how then that will radiate and create waves of change, ideally through our industry, and really making it more accessible with less gatekeeping and no tables. Basically, we want everyone to just, have access to something that we love, and something that has taken us a long time as a collective to gain access to.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, that's, again, it was, I don't know what happened to me in that moment, but that was when I realized that for me, it wasn't just about growing, it's about also that extended life plant. And so part of what, when I introduced myself at the beginning, that shift that I was saying that I was making is not just focusing on, the growing element, but more so that that what happens post that. How can there be this educational component about more ways that we can explore that? So that will be me shifting in the next few months in terms of thinking about those creative ways that we can, reimagine and expand on honoring those flowers and plants.
There's also been a real movement in using everlasting flowers, and I think there's something really special about working with plants that have been dried in the summer, at the height of the summer, and they're primed with their colour and all of their juiciness, and working with them in the winter. So at times like now, after the solstice, we're only just really into the winter months, and creating wreaths or working with dry flowers, and remembering as part of working in that mindful in the way of being mindful with flowers, remembering, like, when you're seeing the color, you're also seeing the sunshine, you're seeing the breeze move through that flower in the summer, you're seeing all the insects that pollinated that plant and all the insects that didn't eat it up. So in a way, you're kind of seeing kind of the whole of life and all of the seasons in that one dried flower. I feel that's something that is really nice to do with flowers that you've dried, or excess flowers that you've not managed to sell, or you don't know what to do with. It's like kind of dry everything, because there's nothing more special and nothing more wondrous than creating something out of everlasting flowers that then offer you that extra bit of joy until the new season starts. And again, working with people who wouldn't necessarily have access to that, or would think to attend a wreath making workshop, is something that is really important. It's kind of, it feels like an act of social responsibility. We're all responsible for making what we love and what we benefit from ourselves on the personal level as accessible to everybody as possible. Yeah.
There's a really good question.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Elsie. I think we're about to touch on the same.
I'm going to turn my video off just in case. Let me turn this off. But I was just having a look at Ellie's comment here. About if we return to a culture of appreciating our local cut flowers, that might help with education around our wild and native flowers. And I completely agree with this sentiment. I think it has this like incredible capacity to really draw us in. I think by like the sight and color and scent, and there is something about working with flowers which kind of creates an awareness, and it's kind of happens similarly in foraging and with herbalism, is when you identify one plant, you see it everywhere. And I think that flowers kind of have this frequency that when you start to tune in, you realize that they're everywhere, and that they start to grow in the most unusual spaces. And I think that growing cut flowers can be an incredible tool for creating that awareness, particularly around wild and native flowers. So yeah, just kind of mirroring your sentiment there, Ellie, that they can be an educational tool.
Absolutely.
I have a couple of questions that were asked earlier on in the chat. Is it right if I go back to them?
Yes, that's great.
Great. So the first one was Marilyn asked, can anyone recommend books on the symbolism of flowers? Any books or resources for the symbolism of different flowers?
There was, let me get the name of it up, because my ability to recall on the spot is Folklore and Symbolism of Flowers. Is an interesting book to check out.
Great, thank you.
Extensive list.
No, that's great.
But a good place to start.
Brilliant. And I've got another question here from Rebecca, who asks, they say it's a question around importing versus local. What would buying more locally do to workers and industries in countries like Kenya, where so many roses are imported and where 1% of Kenya's GDP comes from rose exports? In brackets, it's the second largest after the export of tea. Not sure how to navigate our responsibility locally and globally.
Yeah, I read that one as well. And Sel Robertson, who's an amazing grower, actually responded to that. So I'm just going to read out what she said, because she summed it up quite beautifully, and there's no need for me to add more words to what she already stated. And it says, pre-pandemic, the market share of local UK grower flowers increased, and at the same time, so did the percentage of king and grown roses in the UK. Sales from local and seasonal growers haven't impacted on the imports, as the whole whole cut flower market continues to grow, and local growers are supplying a completely different product from industrial grown imports. There are other challenges for farms overseas that are much greater threats than the local seasonal sector of the industry. So I'll leave it there because it beautifully responds to that.
I'd like to add to what Sel said, really about thinking about what our responsibility as consumers are to these growers in Kenya. And I think that national, even a movement in increasing workers' rights in these countries, and how much kind of purchasing power we have to influence the conditions of these working environments. I know that there are certain certifications that exist in the floral industry. There's one called Flora Verde, which I think was established in Colombia. We also have things like fair trade flowers, organic flowers, and that kind of thing. But what I've noticed really from these certifications is that they're all quite separate. So organic certification will often look at the impacts on the environment, and fair trade will often focus on the impacts of work on the individual and ensuring that they're paid fairly. But there isn't really that joined up thinking that occurs between. So if I was a floriculture, my health could be impacted by my line of work, my pay would be impacted at risk of sexual exploitation. I could be living in an environment that's heavily polluted. And so thinking about these things as holistically as possible, and having a think about what is it that UK consumers can do to have an impact on workers' environments.
One more thing to add to, sorry, go ahead, Anais.
I think it's really important as well. Rebecca brings up such a great point, and it's one that we come across. I certainly come across a lot in conversations with florists. I think it's really important to have a conversation with your customers, and whether or not that's florist, if you've got a platform, in terms of using your platform to educate customers. There's so many friends and family of mine as well who go into a supermarket in February and are like, of course, roses are in season, they're in the supermarket. So it's, we're on this journey with some of our customers as well to bring them into the fray and into the know of what true seasonality means, and the impact of some of the flowers that we have in, accessible to us, and, what the implications of bringing that flower to someone on Mother's Day or for Valentine's Day is. So I think it's a real conversation starter and a real opportunity to engage with customers and position yourself as, someone who's an expert in our industry, who's looking to change, how we navigate through this world in terms of our environmental impact.
Yeah. And the other thing that I was going to add to that is I see you asked a follow-up question in relation to should we be actively discouraging imports? And to add to what Elsie was saying, I think, and to what I was saying earlier in terms of like knowing where our flowers are imported from will help us be able to, make better decisions about what we're investing in and the conditions in which we know that the people working there may be exposed to. And again, this isn't about taking food out of someone's pocket or money out of someone's pocket. This is if we have that buying power and pull, how can we also use that to influence and positively impact upon someone else's living conditions and environment, as well as their pay? So to me, it's not to discourage imports, but I think if we can know more about where our imports are coming from, will help reshape the conversation. We all, at some point or another, say that we won't buy something from somewhere because of blah. We can't say that with flowers. We are just blindly purchasing them, and it could be in complete opposition of our values, or how, we spoke of earlier in relation to human rights and the conditions that people are living in. So when we know more, I think we'll be able to make better decisions. So I'm not saying don't buy imports, but why, you have local, so you can build that relationship and know what's in season, and be able to help others build that relationship with that farmer, and know that you're not just investing in local flowers, you're also investing most likely in your health, because of the conditions that that local farmer would have grown those flowers, and the conditions that they would have grown them in, and knowing that everyone that's working on their farm, or not, even if it's just them, is hopefully being paid better conditions as well. So again, it's not, when you're buying locally, it's not just about, it's also thinking about the better, not only for yourself, but for others as well.
I think Lucy brings up a great point as well. And it's something that we're starting to see, that these huge flower farms in places like Kenya, I keep picking Kenya and roses, quite a few of them aren't owned by people locally. They're usually owned by big companies, primarily based in the US. We have an example here, several examples here in the UK of flower farmers who have set up farms in Kenya. Mm-hmm. And, it's not to point the finger at them or to call them out or put them on blast, but I think it's really looking at, those conversations that we're having in the transparency, and giving customers the option to choose roses or not choose roses, depending on, the ethics, and how do we define ethics of the companies that are selling these flowers. So I think it's, it's just going back to that supply chain, really being at, trying to get the transparency of this journey of flower to table.
Are there any questions that we haven't answered in the chat box that someone would like to just unmute themselves and say aloud?
Sometimes it feels really heavy, and I feel like sometimes it feels like you've just got the weight of the world on you, and like, God, what are we going to do? But it's just really exciting to have so many people here, firstly. So thank you all for spending this hour with us and engaging in this conversation. And, I think flower farming, certainly from a lot of our perspectives, is like an act of resistance of really trying to, make the world a better place through so many different forms. And, even in the interactions that we have when the world feels like a really dark place, the interactions that we have with our customers who are sending flowers to support someone who's going through a really difficult time, or is trying to celebrate, this huge life event, especially during the pandemic when we couldn't be together, was so incredibly special. And so I think it really, just brings us back and grounds us into, it feels sometimes like we're going uphill all the time, but there's so many people that are coming on this journey with us, and appreciating the value of what we're doing. So if you're interested in, doing your own bit and looking into potential resources, these are some of the resources that have really supported us and helped us in our journey. Coventry University, which is on our doorstep here in the UK, has some great research that they publish. I really recommend going to their website and having a look at the resources that they've made publicly available. There are 2 books here that a lot of us were given when we started our flower journey. And I think it's, just so great to be able to have this dialogue with people, and people feel open and receptive to hearing it, and then us going away and working out what that means, and how we take some of these practices and put them into, our businesses moving forward. So just wanted to say thank you all so much for joining us. And let's see, if you want to get in touch with us, we have our details here.
Yeah. So perhaps take a screenshot of this, and so mindful this session will end rather promptly, but also in terms of continued discussion, I think there'll be a continued space for us on the HOVA platform. Brigitte or Han, is that accurate? How can we?
Yeah, if you'd like one, I can just set it up now and pop a link.
Yes, that would be
in fact,
amazing.
yeah, okay, sure. The other way to get there is if you go into Hoover and then into the community section, like in the drop down tabs in the left hand side, if you choose the community section, and it will basically tell you a list of community spaces that people have suggested or are hosting. And if I just call this one like flowers or something like that, and then you can jump into it there. But I'll just set it up now in this last 3 minutes that we've got and put a link in as well.
Awesome. And the images of the slide of the books are up again as well. We're mindful that we went on to the next slide. So feel free to take a screenshot of that one as well. And in these last 3 minutes, if you have any resources that you would like to share, please drop them in the box, the chat box. And we can also, if you have time, if you don't have time to drop them in the chat box, if you could then share them in the WOVA community platform. And someone else asks, how can we begin to cultivate a sense of community? And that's a great question. We're very fortunate that the Flower Fellowship brought us together. And it's been one of the most beautiful things that's come out of us being together. But perhaps we can explore that a bit further on the next platform, because it can be isolating being a grower. And so community is very much needed amongst us, and to be able to ask questions, and the amount of questions that we ask each other is just nice that we have each other to do that, but also to have each other to, this whole discussion, to be able to explore our feelings and our emotions and, think about all of that with someone and not in isolation. So we can pick that up in the HOVA platform, which has just been posted in here. Thank you, Han. So if you maybe copy that link or go ahead and open it up, and we will pick it up there, and we can figure out something from there.
Yeah, and it will actually take you, that link will take you to the community section, because I can't give you a link straight to this space. And then you'll just see that the very top one in the list says flowers continued. And so you can join that stream straight away. I've set it for 1 hour, but like the session will last for 1 hour, but would you like it to be more open than that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'll see if I can change those settings.
Yeah, that would be fab.
Once again, thank you everyone for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's exciting to know that we're not alone, and I'm pulling back the curtains and, with these challenges and, reimagining and wanting to, transform and improve the culture in Flora culture.